Paul talks about we are strangers and sojourners in this world. We're not to feel at home in this world, are we? About the only time I feel at home is when I'm with you folks. You know, I can be comfortable around it. We have like interests. We have the same goals, same aims. And we sung about this morning, I feel like traveling on. That was a special this morning. And that tonight, I don't feel at home in this world anymore. Wouldn't it be awesome if Jesus came back this week? Amen. Woo, man. I'd feel like, man, wow. What is that sermon that you preach? My best day hasn't happened yet. That would be our best day this week if the Lord Jesus came back. Man, thank you. Thank you for that song tonight. Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, if you'll look down at one verse this evening, verse 17. And I hope you'll keep your Bibles out. We're going to be looking at several verses throughout the Scriptures. And as I told you this morning, this is the final commandment, verse 17. And it is one that is definitely hooked up with all the other ones. So it is fitting that it would be the last one. Exodus chapter 20, verse 17 says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's." You could very succinctly put that, thou shalt not covet. And that's the way I remembered learning it as a child. When I learned the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not covet, and just stopped it right there. In the Persian Gulf War, many of you probably remember Saddam Hussein. That name, he called himself the Butcher of Baghdad. And when he went to war with, or actually United States, he started it, all right, and we went back at him, he declared that it was going to be the mother of all battles. And of course, it was not, but that's what he called it. Sometime later, President George Bush Sr., he introduced his wife, Barbara, as the mother of all Bushes. And that statement was a lot truer than what Saddam Hussein had said about it being the mother of all battles. But this, again, is the 10th commandment, and this commandment can appropriately be called, as someone has named it, the mother of all sins. Because it is the sin that leads to all the other sins, all the other commandments being broken. And it centers around this sin called covetousness. Covetousness, if you were to look that up in the dictionary, is defined as an excessive desire for something that you don't have. An excessive desire for something that you don't have. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting things, by the way. There's nothing wrong at all with wanting certain things, like having a better job, or having better pay, or peace of mind, or happiness, or a good marriage, or whatever it may be. It could be to have a nice car, or to have a nice house. There's nothing wrong with wanting those things. But this is talking about not just wanting. This is an excessive desire that compromises our convictions to gain something that we want. In other words, we won't stop at anything. We're not letting anything stop us from getting what we want. It is also an envious desire for what somebody has. In other words, desiring what you have, I want. All right? I want what you have. And even beyond that, I don't just want a nice car because you have a nice car. I want the car that you have, and I don't want you to have it. That's how extensive, that's how far this matter of covetousness goes. This commandment is unique because the other commandments deal with actions. This one deals with attitude. The others are outward. This one's inward. In other words, you have the commandment, thou shalt not steal. That means keep your hands off. This one says, don't covet. That means don't even think about it. So it is an internal type of thing. Again, if you break this commandment, it will lead to breaking other commandments. Let me show you what I mean. The first two commandments that we looked at are, we are not to have any other gods before us. Before God. No other God before Jehovah God. And then we are not to make any graven image. Well, that is talking about idolatry, is it not? Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 says, covetousness is idolatry. In other words, when you covet something, we are making a god out of it. We are giving it priority in our life. And if we're truly coveting something, it will even take priority over what God wants in my life. It is putting something before God. I heard about a man who was
Well, he worshiped basically his sports car. I mean, his sports car was his life. It was everything. He was constantly washing and waxing and buffing and doing all and showing it off and talking about it. That's all he wanted to talk about. Until one day he let his wife drive it. And she took it out for a spin, and that night he said, "Where's the car?" She said, "It won't run." He said, "What do you want? What do you mean it won't run? It runs like a top. What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, it won't run because there's water in the carburetor." He said, "What do you mean there's water in it? You wouldn't know a carburetor from a tailpipe." He said, "Where's the car?" She said, "It's in the neighbor's swimming pool." Now, he had to decide very quickly what was going to be most important to him, did he not? That sports car or his wife. The third commandment says we aren't to take God's name in vain. I think of Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament where they took the Lord's name in vain. They tried to lie to the Lord. They tried to do something and put his name on it, saying it was okay. And it was all because of the sin of covetousness in their hearts. I think of the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. I wonder how many children have neglected the welfare of their parents because of the sin of covetousness. Thou shalt not kill. Every day people kill other folks for what they have. They want what they have, and they want it for themselves. Thou shalt not commit adultery. This sin always begins with covetousness, wanting someone that doesn't belong to you. Thou shalt not steal, coveting what someone else has and taking it. And you can go down through the list of commandments, every single one of them, and you'll see that at the root of breaking every one of the commandments, you have the sin of covetousness. And isn't that where sin begins? It begins in the heart. It begins in our attitude. It is something that is internal. Covetousness is a deadly sin, and it always leads us to where we don't want to go. So we got to have a handle on it. We got to figure out what is it all about, and then how to keep from breaking this commandment. If you can keep from breaking this last commandment, more than likely, it's going to keep you away from breaking the other commandments. So let's look at 3 questions tonight. And I hope that these 3 questions will help us do that. Question number 1, obvious question, what is it? What is covetousness? Well, in the first chapter of Romans, you don't have to turn there, but Paul tells us that the wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. By the way, we've been talking about that on Wednesday night in our Revelation series. That's why God sends judgment during the tribulation period. He's pouring out his wrath on unrighteousness and ungodliness. And it tells us there, Paul does, he tells us that men are filled with all manner of wickedness and corruption. We're born that way. We are born sinners. And then he lists some of the sins. And among those many terrible sins in that list, covetousness is near the top. I think about Achan in the Old Testament. Probably most of us are familiar with his story. Because of what Achan did, he brought reproach and judgment upon the whole nation of Israel during that time. The army of Joshua, they go into Jericho, and God says to Joshua, you're not going to have to fight this battle. I want to fight this battle for you. We know the story. They marched around, and then the last day the walls fell. God did that. It was obvious that God did that. But you remember the cautionary warning that God gave to the people and to Joshua. He said, look, you're going to go into this city. You're going to take possession of this city. But the spoils do not belong to you. You're going to find some treasures there. You're going to find some different things, but they don't belong to you. I believe that was a lesson in tithing, by the way. I believe God was telling them what comes first is me. All right? You give me what belongs to me first before you get what you want. And so they were not to take anything. We know that when Achan went through, he saw some gold. He saw some shekels of silver. He saw a Babylonian garment. He saw them. He coveted those things. He took those things, and then he went back and hid those things in his tent. He tried to hide what he had done. The outcome of that story is one of the saddest in the Bible to me. Joshua chapter 7, verse 25 says, and all Israel stoned him with stones and burned them with fire. I believe his whole family suffered the judgment of Achan. After they had stoned him with stones, he saw, he coveted, he took, he hid. You see that pattern over and over when it comes to coveting things. I see it with David and Bathsheba. The sin of David and Bathsheba, he saw her, he coveted her, the act, and then he tried to cover it up. You see all 4 of those things in place. And the same thing happens for you and me today. Look over in Luke chapter 12. Hold your finger there in Exodus. But look over in Luke chapter 12 with me. Luke chapter 12. Look down in verse 16. There's a story in the Bible here about two fellows, and they were fighting over who was going to get the inheritance. And Jesus said, take heed and beware of covetousness. You see that in verse 15? Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And then Jesus told this story. Follow along with me in verse 16. And he spake a parable. That is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. There's a point to the story. The ground of a certain rich man, verse 16, brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns, build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? Instead of putting his great wealth that God had blessed him with, obviously, instead of putting it to something that was good, maybe helping somebody out, maybe going above and beyond with someone in need and helping them out in some way, he didn't do that. He tried to hoard all the goods to himself. He had the desire, he had the deed, and the deception was on himself. Jesus said, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. See, this sin is so subtle that a lot of times it creeps in on us and we don't even know it. I want you to notice a couple things since we're explaining what covetousness is. First of all, it is a debasing sin. It will cause you to turn into something that other people don't recognize. You know, they don't recognize you. You're not the same person. When covetousness takes over you, you become a whole different creature. 1 Timothy chapter 6 says this, but they that will or want to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and into many foolish and hurtful lusts. It'll cause people to do things that they normally wouldn't do. It is a controlling sin, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through many sorrows. There's nothing wrong with having things. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, being rich. Matter of fact, the Bible has several people in the Bible there that we know that were very wealthy. And they were used by God to do great things. But it is here, the covetousness is a desire for more and more and more and more. You never get satisfied. So it is a debasing sin. It brings you down to a level that you shouldn't be. It changes you. The second thing about this, it is a deceiving sin. It usually the covetous person doesn't know that they're being covetous. They don't realize it. You know, if I steal something, I know I stole it. You know, if I break one of these other commandments, if I don't honor my parents, I know I didn't. I mean, that very quickly comes back around me. I know that. All right, if I put something ahead of God, I can get that very quickly. But this one is so subtle and so deceiving. Paul describes it. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 5, he calls it a cloak of covetousness. And that's exactly true. It's one of those sins that we cover up. And we do it not even knowing it sometimes. We don't want to reveal what's on our heart. And it's an easier sin to kind of hide a better maybe than the others. You see, I promise you, there's probably somebody here tonight, somebody listening on the internet, that might be guilty of this sin. But they don't realize it. They don't realize it. And so what happens is we sit back with our self-righteous shovels and we say, I'm glad those other people are getting it. Now that person needs to hear that. That guy I work with, my neighbor next door, they need to hear this message. And we don't think, because the person that has covetousness in their heart, they don't even realize they have a need to deal with it. Charles Spurgeon said this. I find this quote is so telling. He said, of the thousands that he had seen saved in his lifetime, he never heard someone say that they were saved from the sin of covetousness. And yet it is the mother of all sins. It is the one that leads to all the rest. That's very interesting. It is a debasing sin. It is a deceiving sin. It is a damning sin. It is one that we ought to take seriously. Ephesians 5:5 says, for this ye know that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. That's serious business. You mean covetousness can keep me out of God's family? Absolutely. It sure can. There are people that you know, there are people that I know, there are people all over everywhere that will not come to church, and this is the reason they give. They want something out of me. They want my money. They want my time. They want, they want me. They want my talents. They want my name. They want something, and they will not go to church, and that's the reason. And again, there's a variety of ways to express that, but they will not come. You know what they're doing? They are allowing that one thing that's in their mind. Now, that's not true, and I know that might be true some places, but that's not true here. We're not looking to get things out of people that come here. We're out to give some things to people that come here, right? Give peace of God and relationship with God and a family and all these things. But what folks are doing when they use that excuse is this. They are allowing that to come between them and their relationship with God. And they're coveting those things. This is more important to me than having a relationship with God. This is more important to me than being faithful to God's house and being a part of God's family. And they're coveting that, and many people, their soul will be damned for all of eternity because of that one thing, because of covetousness. So what is it? Well, we just explained it. Question number 2, where does it come from? Jesus tells us. He says in Mark chapter 7, for from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murders, thefts, covetousness. Where does it come from? It comes from your heart. Ezekiel said it in Ezekiel chapter 33. With their mouth they show much love, but their heart goeth after their covetousness. I think about old King Ahab in the Old Testament. You remember he was out and he was looking around and he saw Naboth's vineyard one day. And he started looking at it. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with admiring things. You got a nice car, I'm going to admire it with you. I'm going to say, wow, that's a nice car. But he took another step, didn't he? He said, not only do I admire that vineyard, that's a beautiful vineyard, I want it. And I want it for myself. And here's where covetousness kicks in. If it became his property, then it was no longer Naboth's property. But Naboth, if you know that story, he couldn't sell it to the king. Even if he was the king, he couldn't sell it to the king. This was a family inheritance. It was passed down from generation to generation. So he's not going to sell him this piece of property and the vineyard on it. So he turns the offer down to the king. And the king, what does he do? Like a little spoiled brat, he goes back home and he pouts. And he mopes around the house. And he's dragging his feet and his lips. He's got that poochy lip disease. And he's and it goes over in the corner somewhere. And here comes Jezebel. Oh, wicked Queen Jezebel. I don't know if there's ever been a more wicked woman on the face of the earth than Jezebel. She comes in. She says, what is up with you? What is going on? Well, I was over at Naboth's vineyard and he wouldn't give it to me. And I tried to sell it. And like a little kid, don't you worry, honey. I'll take care of it for you. We know what happened. She got 2 witnesses to testify against him, ended up killing Naboth. And wouldn't you know it, the vineyard is open for sale. And it becomes the property of King Ahab. He took possession of it, something that didn't belong to him. What happened? His covetousness led to stealing that piece of property and led to murder. You see how covetousness leads to other things. Elijah, remember, comes along to the vineyard as Ahab is standing there admiring his new piece of property. And he says, in the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine. He pronounced judgment on him. Judgment follows covetousness. It is a serious thing. The heart of the problem was that he had a problem with his heart. His heart wasn't right. And like so many today, Ahab needed his heart changed. And the only way that we can do right is by thinking right. The only way to think right is by giving our heart to Jesus and think like he does. So many try to make lasting changes in their life by doing all these other things other than making a commitment to Christ. Well, I'm going to turn over a new leaf. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to do better. I'm going to adopt this phrase or this motto or whatever. But they don't come into making a commitment to Christ, and it doesn't work like that. So many try to find contentment, as we talked about this morning, that Paul said, I've learned whatsoever state I'm in, therewith to be content. They try to find contentment in things without finding Christ first. And again, it doesn't work like that. That is impossible. Hebrews 13:5 says, let your conversation, that is how you live your life. That's your actions, that's your attitude, that is the choices that you make. Let your conversation be without covetousness. And be content with such things as you have, for he have said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Hey, look, if we don't have a right relationship with Christ, you can't have victory over the sin of covetousness. It will eat you up. So if you don't, then we face question number 3. Where does it lead? Where does this sin lead? Well, there was a successful businessman and his friends one day, and they were kind of gathered together, and they were celebrating their success together. They had worked day and night for months and months and months, and finally they had pulled it off, whatever it was, and they had been successful. And so they kind of had a little gathering, a party there, and they were like swapping stories. And one of the businessmen said, he started telling stories about his childhood, and he talked about how poor they were when they were growing up, and how far he had come, and how hard he had worked to get where he was today. And he said when he was a kid, somebody came and gave him a big coin. I don't know what the denomination was, but gave him a big coin. And that was a big deal when he was a kid, if you had a coin that belonged to you. And he said, you would not believe what I made my sister do, all because she wanted to hold that coin. He said, I could get her to do all kinds of chores. He said, I remember one day, he said, she went out, one of my jobs was to take care of the cows, and she took care of the cows all day long just to hold on to that coin at the end of the day. He said, but here's the thing, the joke was on her. At the end of every day, she had to give it right back to me. She didn't get to keep it. And so the next day, I'd just get her to do something else. And he just kind of laughed about it, and the other guys laughed, but there was one guy, there was an older guy there, and he was a wiser fella. And he said, don't you see what's happening? He said, you're doing the same thing your sister did. He said, what do you mean? He said, you're killing yourself. You're working day and night and pouring your whole life into this. And you're for what? To have this little success? To have this little possession? And there's coming a day, at the end of the day, you're going to have to give it all back. You're going to have to leave it all behind. That's exactly how it is with all of us. Jesus warned us this way. Lay up not for yourselves treasures in heaven or upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. I wonder how many today are destroying their very life through covetousness. How many folks are ruining their life, ruining their marriages, ruining the relationship with their children, missing out on the everyday joys of life that God puts in their life. They're missing out on all of those things just to have a little bit more, and a little bit more. You know what? You never get there, by the way. That line that you set there, oh, if I could just get here, then I would be happy. You know what happens when you get to the line? It moves. It moves. It never stays there. You reach that line, you find out, you know what, I'm not satisfied staying here. Are the things tonight that you're spending all your energy on, spending all your time involved in, are they going to be worth it in the long run? Are they going to matter on the other side of eternity? Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. What things? What are all these things? He's talking about the important things, the worthwhile things, the things that are going to matter. It is said that when Alexander the Great had conquered all of the known world during that time, he instructed his officers when he died to make sure his hands were hanging outside of his coffin, so that when people come by, it was to show everybody that though he had conquered the world, he would carry nothing with him to his next life. Please don't make the mistake in your life using your day after day after day with just this constant desire to have something more. Never being content with what you have. You know what? I know we've got this, but wouldn't it be better if we had this? I know this day went this way, but wouldn't it have been better if it had went that way? If you go through life unsatisfied, you're going to be miserable, and you're going to make the people around you miserable as well. Apostle Paul said this, for I have learned, I mentioned this a while ago, in whatsoever state I am in, therewith to be content. Covetousness is found in the pursuit of things that aren't going to matter in the long run. Contentment can only be found in a life that is lived for Christ. There's only one area, by the way, in all the Bible that it tells us that we ought to covet. Isn't that something? We got a commandment, thou shalt not covet. But there's one area that it tells us that we ought to covet. And I want to show you that area. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 31. It says, but covet earnestly the best gifts. Covet earnestly. What are the best gifts? That's a good thing to know, right? If we're to covet those things, obviously we don't have those things like when we're born. So what are those things? Well, turn over to Galatians chapter 5, and I'm going to show you what those things are. We'll end our message tonight with this. Galatians chapter 5. We're going to look down in verse 22. Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 22. You know probably this passage. Some of you's probably got it up on your wall or your refrigerator at your house. It's the fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And they that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not be desirous of vain glory, provoking one another, envying one another. I ask you tonight, are you living in the Spirit? What does that mean to live in the Spirit? That means you live each day in a relationship with Jesus Christ. He's not just somebody you call on when you need him. He's not just somebody that you visit with on Sunday and Wednesday. You have that relationship. You are living in the Spirit. And then are you walking in the Spirit? That means, are you coveting the right things? What kind of things should we covet? Well, we just read the list right there. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. Those are the things that we ought to desire in our life. How do you get those things? By living in the Spirit and by walking in the Spirit. My prayer tonight is that each of us would allow Jesus to have his way in our everyday life. If he has his way in our life, we won't have a problem with this sin tonight. If he has first place, if he has priority in what we do and how we live and our decision making, this is not going to give us an issue at all. Putting him first in all that we do. Let's stand together this evening.